The heart monitor flatlined. But William Sterling wasn't mourning. He was shredding documents, his hands shaking as the machine screamed behind him. 2 debt collectors just put his brother Robert in a chokehold, and the brass bookend in his grip was the only thing between him and a broken skull. The safe key was slick with blood in his palm, but the real nightmare was the audio playing from Claire's phone. His father's last whisper. David Miller. A name none of them knew. And then the front door slammed open again. The industrial hum of the shredder devoured the final pages of the Shell Corp ledgers, vibrating through William's fingertips. Fine gray dust coated the mahogany desk, smelling of scorched dust and recycled timber. Across the workspace, Marcus Thorne gripped a fountain pen, his knuckles white against the silver barrel as he forged the last of the asset transfers. Through the heavy oak door, the rhythmic hiss of a ventilator pulsed from the master suite. It sounded like a dying bellows. Each mechanical breath marked another $1,000 scrubbed clean, another liability reduced to confetti. William reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver-plated coin. He flipped it. Clink? It hit his palm with a cold, metallic bite. He caught it cleanly. 1. He flipped it again. 2. He had to hit 5 before he could feel the air in the room stop pressing against his chest. The federal investigators were circling like sharks in dark water. And here he was, standing in the center of his father's library, trying to erase a decade of venture capital fraud before the old man's heart gave out. "Your hand is shaking," Marcus whispered, his eyes fixed on the shifting pile of paper strips. The lawyer didn't look up. He was too busy making sure the ink on the forged signatures looked exactly like the shaky scrawl of a dying billionaire. William tightened his grip on a stack of agreements. The parchment resisted, stiff and cold. "My father spent 40 years building this labyrinth. It takes more than a quiet afternoon to tear it down." Marcus didn't answer. He swapped the pen for a heavy wax seal, the flame of the candle dancing in his pupils. The scent of melting paraffin mingled with the medicinal tang drifting from the sick room, rubbing alcohol and stale lilies. A sharp, rattling cough erupted from the bedroom, followed by the frantic chime of a heart monitor. William froze. The shredder continued its mindless mastication, pulling a $3 million fraud into its teeth. "Finish the signatures," William commanded, his voice raspy. "The old man isn't going to wait for the ink to dry." He fed the next document into the slot. The machine groaned, swallowing the evidence of their inheritance. Every page that vanished was a weight off his soul, a shield against the prison cell that had been haunting his dreams for months. He needed this transition to be seamless. He needed the sterling fortune to move into his accounts before the feds realized the innovative tech he'd sold to investors was nothing more than a series of empty shells and hollow promises. The heavy library door creaked open, and the smell of expensive jasmine perfume cut through the scent of burnt paper. Eleanor stood there, her sharp bob perfectly in place, her diamonds catching the dim light of the library. She was already wearing black, but it wasn't for mourning. She moved into the room, her eyes scanning the mess of paper. She pulled a vintage lace handkerchief from her sleeve and began to scrub the back of a velvet chair, counting under her breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, she whispered, her voice a soft, airy blade. She sat down only after the 7th stroke. "William, we need to talk about the yacht. The Sea Star. I've already spoken to the brokers in Newport." William didn't stop the shredder. "The yacht is an asset, Eleanor. It's part of the consolidation. I can't just hand you the keys so you can sell it to pay off your Bergdorf bill. It's not just a bill, William. she snapped, her rings clicking against the mahogany as she twisted them. My credit lines are frozen. The club is asking questions. If I don't settle the seasonal dues by Friday, the stain on my reputation will be permanent. You know how Father felt about flaws. I won't be the one who brings shame to this house. You've already brought the debt, William countered, flipping his coin a third time. Clink. I'm trying to save the entire empire, and you're worried about country club lunch credits. The argument was a familiar dance, a bitter melody they had played for years, but it was cut short by a heavy thud from the foyer. The front door hadn't just opened. It had been slammed against the marble wall. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, the sound of work boots that didn't belong on the hand-woven rugs of the Sterling estate. Robert Sterling burst into the hallway, his jaw covered in 3 days' stubble, his chest puffed out like a brawler looking for a fight. He wasn't alone. 2 men followed him, thick-necked men in leather jackets that smelled of stale cigarettes and rain. One of them, a man with a scarred eyebrow named Richard Green, was already chewing on a toothpick, the rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch of splintering wood filling the sudden silence. "Where is he?" Robert shouted, his voice vibrating through the floorboards. He began cracking his knuckles, starting with his left pinky. Pop, pop. "Where's the King of Greenwich hiding his gold?" William stepped out of the library, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Robert, get out. Father is dying 20 feet away. Have some decency." "Decency?" Robert laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "I don't need decency, Will. I need $200,000, or Mr. Green here is going to start taking pieces of me home in a sack. And since you're the one holding the checkbook, I figured I'd come to the source." The hallway felt smaller, the walls closing in like a throat. The grandfather clock at the end of the hall ticked with a deafening rhythm, pulsing through the soles of William's Italian loafers. "I don't have it," William said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Everything is tied up in the transition. You know the rules." "The rules changed when I lost the spread on the Giants game," Robert growled. He lunged forward, grabbing William by the lapels of his bespoke suit. The assault was sudden and brutal. One of the debt collectors shoved William against the ornate wallpaper, the back of his head hitting a framed portrait of some long-dead ancestor. Stars danced in his vision. He felt a hand dive into his pocket, searching for the safe key he'd taken from his father's nightstand earlier that morning. "Give it up, Flipper," Robert hissed, his breath smelling of cheap whiskey and desperation. William felt a surge of cold, sharp adrenaline. He wasn't the athlete Robert was, but he was cornered. And a cornered man is a dangerous thing. His hand brushed against a heavy brass bookend sitting on a side table, a stylized eagle with sharp, metallic wings. He gripped it, the cold metal biting into his palm, and swung with everything he had. The brass connected with the side of the collector's head with a sickening thud. The man slumped, his knees buckling. William didn't wait. He shoved Robert back, his fingers closing tight around the safe key in his pocket. "Get out!" William screamed, his voice cracking. "Before I call the police and tell them you're trying to murder a dying man for his watch." Richard Green stopped chewing his toothpick. He looked at his fallen partner, then at William, then at the frantic, shaking mess that was Robert. He swallowed the splintered wood of his toothpick and reached for a new one. "We'll be back, Sterling." Interest doesn't stop just because someone's heart does. They dragged their unconscious companion out, the heavy doors groaning as they closed. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. It was a hollow, expectant silence, broken only by the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilator in the next room. Eleanor was leaning against the wall, her face pale, her hands frantically scrubbing her lace handkerchief. "He's going to kill us all, William. Robert is going to burn this house down with us inside." "He won't," William said, though his hands were shaking so hard he had to shove them into his pockets. He felt the safe key, the small, jagged piece of steel that represented their only hope of survival. "He's a dog with no teeth. We just need to finish the paperwork." From the shadows of the stairs, a soft, rhythmic whispering started. Claire was standing there, her face illuminated by the blue light of her smartphone. She was holding it up like a holy relic, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Guys, you won't believe this," she whispered into the phone, her voice hushed and dramatic. "The tension is literal glass right now. My brothers are actually fighting in the hall while our father takes his last breaths. It's so raw. Hashtag Sterling legacy, hashtag family drama." "Claire, put that damn thing away," William snapped. "I can't," she said, turning the camera toward him. "The engagement is spiking. Everyone wants to see the end of the Sterlings. But listen, I was in there. I was recording his final thoughts for the memorial montage." She hit play on an audio file. The sound was grainy, buried under the mechanical wheeze of the ventilator. But through the static, a voice emerged. Arthur Sterling's voice. A slow, grinding crawl. "David," the voice wheezed. "David Miller. Find him. The pact. It's time." William felt a cold prickle dance across his skin. He looked at Marcus, who had emerged from the library, his face a mask of gray neutrality. "Who the hell is David Miller?" William asked. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He began lining up his pens on the hallway table, ensuring they were exactly 1 inch apart. "I have no record of a David Miller in the primary estate files, William. But your father always kept a second set of books. Books I wasn't allowed to see." The mystery of the name hung in the air, like the smell of ozone before a storm. The Sterlings were no longer just waiting for a death. They were waiting for a ghost to arrive. The night deepened, the Greenwich mansion becoming a tomb of shadows and secrets. The temperature in the house seemed to drop, the air conditioning humming at a bone-chilling 62 degrees. William walked the hallways, his feet silent on the skewed runner rugs. He kept thinking about the name. David Miller. It sounded so common, so unremarkable. Yet his father had spent his final strength to utter it. He returned to the study, needing to finish the codicil. If he could just add a small clause, a final instruction that gave him sole oversight of the liquid assets, he could pay off the feds and keep Robert's goons at bay. He sat at the mahogany desk and reached for the drawer where the official Sterling legal stationery was kept. The drawer was empty. He frowned, pulling it all the way out. The heavy, gold-embossed paper was gone. The official wax seals, the ones Marcus needed to authorize the transfers, were missing from their velvet-lined box. "Marcus?" William called out, his voice echoing in the vaulted ceiling. The lawyer appeared in the doorway, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" "The stationery. The seals. They were here an hour ago." Marcus stepped forward, his eyes scanning the desk. He began to rub his palms together in a circular motion, the dry wash of a man who smelled failure. "I haven't touched them, William. I was in the kitchen getting tea." "Then who?" They both looked toward the stairs. Eleanor was in her room, likely sedated by a martini. Robert was somewhere, hopefully passed out. Claire was busy editing her grief videos. "Someone is in this house," William whispered. "Someone who knows exactly what we're trying to do." He turned to the security monitors sitting on the corner of the desk. The screens showed the various rooms of the mansion in grainy black and white. He looked at the feed for Arthur's bedroom. His breath hitched. The camera, which usually provided a wide angle of the bed and the medical equipment, was slowly rotating. It wasn't a malfunction. It was being controlled. It turned away from the dying man and pointed directly at the door, as if waiting for someone to enter. "The system is being hijacked," William said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He tried to regain control, but the screen flashed a series of symbols he didn't recognize. It was like 1,000 fists pounding on a door at once, a flood of data designed to overwhelm the system. The lights in the library flickered once, twice, and then died. The only light came from the blue glow of the monitors and the pale moon through the windows. Krr-ack. A deafening sound tore through the silence of the foyer. It sounded like a gunshot, but heavier. William and Marcus ran to the balcony overlooking the grand entrance. The massive portrait of their mother, a 10-foot oil painting that had hung there for 30 years, lay face down on the marble floor. The gilded frame was shattered into 1,000 jagged splinters. The wire hadn't snapped. The heavy iron bolt had been unscrewed from the wall. "This isn't a ghost, William," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "This is a message." Before William could respond, the kitchen door swung open, and Robert stumbled out. He looked worse than before. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements twitchy and erratic. But it wasn't the withdrawal making him shake this time. It was the snub-nosed revolver he was holding in his right hand. "The key," Robert rasped, his voice a jagged edge. "I'm done waiting for the lawyers. I'm done waiting for the heart to stop. Give me the key to the safe, or I start putting holes in the furniture. And maybe in you." "Robert, put the gun down," William said, stepping slowly down the stairs, his hands raised. "You're not a killer. You're just a gambler who had a bad night." "I had a bad decade," Robert screamed. He cracked his knuckles against the grip of the gun. Pop. "Father treated us like dogs, and you're just the one who learned how to beg the best. I want my share, now." He lunged toward Eleanor, who had appeared at the top of the stairs. He grabbed her by the arm, spinning her around and pressing the cold barrel of the gun against her temple. "The key, Will. I'm counting to 3. William looked at the safe key in his hand. He looked at his sister's terrified face, her eyes wide as she tried to remember her 7-count scrubbing ritual to stave off the panic. "Okay," William said, his voice low. "Okay, Robert. Just take it." He stepped forward, holding the key out. Robert reached for it, his greed momentarily overriding his caution. That was the opening. Eleanor, driven by a sudden, sharp burst of survival instinct, slammed her elbow into Robert's ribs. The gun went off. The sound was a physical blow, a roar that shattered a nearby vase and sent a spray of porcelain through the air. The bullet missed them, burying itself in the mahogany paneling. William tackled his brother, the two of them crashing into the kitchen island. The smell of burnt garlic and copper-like blood filled the air as they struggled for the weapon. Robert was stronger, but William was desperate. He grabbed a heavy glass pitcher from the counter and smashed it over Robert's head. The glass exploded. Robert groaned, his grip loosening. William kicked the gun across the floor, where it slid under the industrial refrigerator. "Help me!" William shouted to Marcus. Together, they dragged the semi-conscious Robert toward the back of the kitchen, down the narrow stairs that led to the wine cellar. It was a reinforced room, built to protect vintage Bordeaux from temperature swings. It was also a cage. They threw him inside and slammed the heavy oak door, throwing the deadbolt. Robert's fists began to pound against the wood, a muffled, rhythmic thudding that sounded like a heart beating from inside the earth. We can't keep him there forever, Eleanor sobbed, clutching her bruised arm. We only need to keep him there until morning, William said, wiping a smear of blood from his forehead. Until the money is moved. He turned to Marcus. Tell me about the accounts. If we can't find the stationery, we move the funds digitally. Now, Marcus looked at him, and for the first time, the gray man looked truly old. He led William back to the library, his footsteps heavy. He pulled up a series of ledgers on his laptop, his fingers moving in a frantic, parallel dance. William, Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. I've been digging into the primary investment accounts, the ones your father told me were the bedrock of the Sterling name. And they're gone. William felt the world tilt. What do you mean gone? There's over $200 million in the trust. There was, Marcus said, turning the screen around. But over the last 10 years, there have been systematic, monthly transfers. Small enough to avoid immediate red flags, but consistent. All of them going to a private holding company in Ohio. William stared at the numbers. The wealth he had lied for, the crimes he had committed to protect the legacy, the decade he had spent waiting for his father to die so he could finally be successful. It was all an illusion. The Sterling fortune wasn't a mountain of iron. It was a pile of ash. Who owns the holding company? William asked, his voice hollow. It's a blind trust, Marcus said. But the name on the wire authorizations, the one your father signed himself every month. William didn't need to hear it. He already knew. David Miller, he whispered. The realization was a gut punch. They weren't fighting for an inheritance. They were fighting for the scraps of a feast that had already been eaten by a stranger. Subverted beat 2.5. William sat in the high-backed leather chair, the silence of the library pressing in on him like the weight of the ocean. He looked at the empty shredder, then at the monitor where his father's chest still rose and fell with mechanical precision. He felt a strange, hysterical urge to laugh. He had spent 5 years carefully constructing a web of lies to cover his venture capital fraud, convinced that once he inherited the Sterling millions, he could pay back the borrowed funds and walk away clean. It was a smart plan. It was logical. The math was on his side. He just had to wait. He had sacrificed his relationships, his sleep, and his soul to be the good son who would take over the empire. It's okay, William said, his voice gaining a sudden, desperate confidence. The Ohio accounts. That's where the money is. Father didn't spend it. He moved it. He was hiding it from the feds, just like I was. He was protecting the legacy in his own way. Marcus nodded slowly, a small smile touching his lips. That makes sense, William. Your father was a master of the shell game. He probably moved the liquidity to Ohio to keep it out of the reach of the New York tax authorities. We just need to find the access codes. William felt a wave of relief wash over him. His shoulders dropped, and his breathing slowed for the first time in days. He wasn't ruined. He was just in the middle of a more complex deal than he'd realized. Exactly. We find Miller. We get the codes. We settle the debts. The empire stays intact. He looked at the monitor again. The red light of the security camera pulsed. 1, 2, 3. For a moment, everything felt right. The plan was back on track. But then, he noticed a small detail, a crack in the facade. Marcus was still looking at the screen, but his fingers weren't moving anymore. He was staring at a specific line in the ledger, a final transfer made only 3 hours ago. William, Marcus said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "What is it?" "This isn't a holding company. I just looked up the tax ID." A cold prickle danced across William's skin. He leaned over Marcus's shoulder. The name of the recipient wasn't Miller Holdings or Sterling Trust. It was the Miller Foundation for Spinal Cord Research. The truth hit William like a physical blow. The money wasn't being hidden. It was being donated. For 10 years, Arthur Sterling had been systematically liquidating his empire, sending every cent of the legacy to a charity. "He didn't move it," William whispered, his knees going weak. "He gave it away." The betrayal was total. Arthur hadn't been testing them to see who was strong enough to lead. He had been watching them scramble like rats in a sinking ship, knowing all along that there was no treasure at the bottom. The small sum left in the estate wasn't even enough to cover the property taxes on the mansion. William was worse than penniless. He was a fraud with no way to pay back his investors, a criminal whose only shield had just been revealed as a hollow shell. The feds wouldn't just take his money. They would take his life. He knew. William gasped, clutching the edge of the desk. He watched me sign those papers today. He watched me shred the evidence. He let me commit those crimes because he knew I'd never have the money to cover them. He didn't just disinherit me. He destroyed me. The sound of the ventilator from the next room seemed to grow louder, a rhythmic, mechanical mockery. Hiss, click. "I got you." Hiss, click. "You're nothing." The morning light was gray and unforgiving, filtering through the Greenwich mist like a cold shroud. The funeral had been a brief, sterile affair. Just the siblings, Marcus, and a handful of business associates who looked like they were attending a deposition rather than a burial. As the black cars pulled back through the iron gates of the mansion, the illusion of safety shattered. 3 dark SUVs were parked in the driveway, their engines idling. Men in windbreakers with FBI stenciled in yellow across the back were already moving toward the front door. Jennifer Martinez stood on the porch, her feet shoulder-width apart, her 4-color pen clicking in a rhythmic sequence. Click, snap. Red, click, snap. Blue. "William Sterling," she said, her voice a flat, clinical instrument. "We have a warrant for your arrest. Securities fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement." I need to speak to my lawyer," William said, his voice sounding small in the vastness of the foyer. "I'm right here, William," Marcus said, stepping forward. But he didn't move to defend his client. He moved to the side, opening his briefcase to show the agents a stack of documents. "I have the requested filings right here, Agent Martinez. My client has been disorganized, but I've done my best to cooperate." William looked at Marcus, the betrayal of the previous night echoing in his chest. "Marcus, what are you doing?" "I'm an officer of the court, William," Marcus said, his gray eyes cold. "I cannot be a party to your personal diversions of investor funds." While the agents began to lead William toward the study, Claire and Eleanor were frantically tearing through Arthur's humidor in the library. They weren't looking for cigars. "There has to be something," Eleanor cried, her diamonds clashing against the wood as she searched. "He wouldn't leave us with nothing. It's not possible." Claire pulled a small leather-bound ledger from a hidden compartment in the bottom of the humidor. She opened it, her eyes widening. "Wait, look at this. Cayman Islands, account 7749. Current balance, $50 million. She looked at Eleanor, a spark of hope lighting up her filtered face. He had a secret account. He didn't give it all away. This is it. This is our way out. William, being held by 2 agents in the doorway, saw the ledger. He felt a sudden, desperate surge of hope. 50 million. It was enough. It was more than enough to pay off the feds, settle Robert's debts, and start over. "We can fix this," William shouted to his sisters. "Get the account number to Marcus. Tell him to file an emergency stay." The tension was broken by a shadow falling across the foyer floor. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the storm. He was wearing a simple flannel shirt and work boots, his face scarred and somber. "I'm looking for the Sterling family," the man said, his voice a low, steady vibration. "Who the hell are you?" William demanded, struggling against the agent's grip. "My name is David Miller," the man said. William saw red. This was the man who had been taking his inheritance for 10 years. This was the ghost who had hollowed out his life. With a roar of pure, animal rage, William broke free from the agents and lunged at Miller. They tumbled out onto the rain-slicked driveway, a brutal, messy struggle of fists and elbows. William swung wildly, driven by a decade of resentment and fear. Miller didn't fight back with the same ferocity. He simply absorbed the blows, his eyes filled with a strange, weary pity. "You thief!" William screamed, his knuckles splitting against Miller's jaw. "You took everything, you parasitic piece of—" "I didn't take anything, William," Miller said, pinning William's arms to the ground with surprising strength. "Your father gave it to me, not because I wanted it, because it was the only way he could sleep at night. You're a blackmailer? I'm a man who can't walk without a brace because your father ran a red light 20 years ago," Miller said, his voice calm even as the rain soaked through his shirt. "I'm the man he tried to buy off, and when I wouldn't take his money, he spent the rest of his life trying to earn my forgiveness. I'm not here for your millions, William. I'm here because he asked me to be the witness." "Witness to what?" "The end," Miller said. Subverted beat 3.5. Marcus Thorne appeared on the porch, holding the ledger Claire had found. He called everyone back into the library, the agents, the siblings, even David Miller. "I have reviewed the secret ledger," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the cold room. He looked at the siblings, who were huddled together, their faces lit with the desperate hope of the $50 million offshore account. William felt a strange sense of victory. He had been smart enough to keep his sisters looking. He had been smart enough to realize his father would have a backup. "Tell them, Marcus. Tell the agents the funds are being repatriated. We can settle the fraud charges today." Marcus didn't smile. He didn't even look at the ledger. He looked at the grandfather clock, waiting for the chime. "The account in the Cayman Islands does exist," Marcus began, "and the balance is indeed $50 million. Eleanor let out a sob of relief. Claire began whispering into her phone. "Guys, the miracle is actually happening. We're saved. #SterlingStrong. However," Marcus continued, his voice dropping an octave, "I also found the trigger for this account. Your father set up a final digital audit. The funds were only to be released to you if, upon his death, you showed moral growth. Specifically, if you didn't attempt to forge documents, assault each other, or prioritize the money over the truth." The silence in the room became absolute. "By finding this ledger," Marcus said, "and by immediately trying to use it to cover your crimes, you have triggered the greed clause. The account was a lure, William, a final test of your character, and you failed it 3 minutes ago." William felt the floor disappear. "A test? You're telling me he dangled $50 million in front of us just to see if we'd grab it?" "And because you grabbed it," Marcus said, "the entire $50 million was just wired to the Miller Foundation. The account is now empty. The ledger was a mirror, William. It showed him exactly who you were, one last time. The betrayal was so perfectly engineered, it felt like a work of art. Arthur Sterling hadn't just disinherited them. He had led them to the very edge of salvation and then pushed them off. He had used their own greed to ensure they ended up with nothing. The no way out moment was total. William looked at the federal agents. They weren't waiting anymore. One of them pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "William Sterling," Agent Martinez said, "you're under arrest." The eviction was swift and clinical. By noon, the mansion was swarming with movers hired by the bank, tossing designer luggage and antique furniture into the mud of the driveway. William stood by the iron gates, his hands cuffed behind his back. He watched Eleanor screaming at a mover who was carrying her 7-scrubbed velvet chair toward a van. He watched Claire trying to find the right lighting for her homeless debut. He looked at Marcus, who was standing by his own car, his pens perfectly lined up on the dashboard. "Marcus," William called out, "one last thing." The lawyer looked over. "I have the shipping manifests," William said, his voice flat. "The real ones. The ones that show the illegal arms deals father was running through the Shell Corp accounts in the 90s. The ones your name is all over." Marcus froze. "If I'm going down for a few million in venture capital fraud," William said, "you're going down for 20 years of international arms trafficking. Unless you give the feds everything. Every account, every name, every bit of dirt this family ever touched. Let's burn the mountain to the ground, Marcus. Let's see what's left in the ash." Marcus Thorne, the man of gray, finally looked afraid. He nodded slowly. David Miller stood in the shadows of the mansion, watching the destruction. He didn't look happy. He looked like a man who had finally seen a long, painful story come to its inevitable conclusion. "He loved you, in his own way," Miller said, walking toward the gate. "He just didn't know how to love anything that wasn't made of iron." "He didn't love us," William said, looking at the darkened windows of the house. "He just wanted to see if we were as hard as he was. And he was disappointed to find out we were just as hollow." As the police car door closed, William looked at the silver coin lying in the mud of the driveway. It was face down. The Sterling legacy was gone. The treasure they had spent 10 years fighting for was nothing more than a series of lessons, and they had failed to learn. As the car pulled away, the only sound was the distant, fading rhythm of the rain hitting the pavement. A cold, steady beat that sounded like a clock finally running out of time. The siblings stood on the public sidewalk, their designer clothes soaked, their lives reduced to what they could carry. They were no longer Sterlings. They were just people, standing in the rain, realizing that the 10 years they had wasted being monsters were the only thing they had truly inherited. David Miller turned away, disappearing into the morning mist, leaving the ghosts of the Sterling legacy to haunt the pavement of Greenwich. The mountain was gone. Only the ash remained. The end.